I'm Deanna Knoll, and I am going to read Bay of the North by Ronald Syme. The Story of Pierre Radisson. Chapter 1. A Fight in the Forest. Young Pierre Radisson stared out of a loophole in the high wooden stockade. Spring had come to Canada. The forest encircling the little French settlement of 3 Rivers had turned a soft, lovely green. Pierre longed to walk across the fields and go in among the trees where he would find the trails of wild animals. He wanted to roam along those trails, stepping lightly on the deep, springy layer of pine needles underfoot. But there were other things in the forest besides wolves and deer. The year was 1652. Every spring, war parties of fierce Iroquois Indians came up from the south. Their tomahawks were freshly sharpened, their lean faces and shaven heads smeared with war paint. During the summer months, they roamed along the shores of the St. Lawrence River, attacking the tiny French settlements that lay in their path. Pierre had arrived in Canada only a year ago, but already he knew terrible things about these Iroquois. Even before he had left the little fishing village of St. Malo on the coast of France, he had heard dreadful stories that travelers brought back across the Atlantic. Pierre Radisson knew that even now war parties might be prowling through the woods. Fear of them kept the settlers behind their high stockade. When the men went out to tend their fields or graze their cattle, they were careful to walk in small parties. Each man carried a musket and a couple of pistols. That sweet-smelling forest would be a wonderful place after a freezing winter behind high wooden walls. But Pierre's parents had forbidden him to go outside the stockade. And Pierre knew they were right. The Iroquois would scalp any rash settler who went too far. A boy of 16 would have no chance against them at all. "Ho there, Pierre!" Pierre looked round. 2 young men were coming towards him. They were the sons of other settlers. Both of them were husky fellows of 18 or 19. They were wearing fringed deerskin coats and stout leather knee breeches. From the broad straps across their shoulders hung pouches holding coarse black gunpowder and lead shot. Under their arms they were carrying long-barreled muskets. "We're going into the forest," said one of the boys. "All winter we've eaten nothing but salted pork. Fresh meat will taste good after so long. Jean here saw a deer in the fields this morning." "Come with us, Pierre," said the other lad. "The more guns, the better." Pierre looked at the hunters, then he looked at the forest. He knew the danger, and so did his friends. They wanted to be reckless and to boast of their courage afterwards. What a fine thing it would be to return later in the day carrying fat game and describing how far they had traveled in Indian country. One of the young men noticed Pierre's hesitation. "If you fear for your scalp," he taunted, "then stay here with your mother and sisters. We'll go alone." Pierre's brown face grew angry. He was a strong young fellow, quick on his feet and afraid of nothing. "I'm not afraid," he said. "Wait here for me." A few minutes later, the 3 hunters passed through the heavy door of the stockade, Pierre now carrying his own musket. A couple of pistols loaded with heavy shot were stuck in the wide leather belt round his waist. He had picked up his weapons without meeting any of his family. No one but himself and his friends knew anything of the hunting trip. They crossed the sunny fields, joking and laughing, jumping over fallen tree trunks, glad to be away from the dreary little settlement. Soon they reached the edge of the dim, silent forest. Its gloom damped the high spirits of the hunters. They halted among the first trees and looked at one another with questioning eyes. "Why do we hesitate?" asked one of Pierre's friends. "Let us swear here and now that we will all stand together no matter what happens." They shook hands. Then they chose different paths and prepared to start hunting. Pierre and one of the others began walking along the bank of the great river. The 3rd youth entered the wood. A mile farther on they all met in a clearing. They had seen nothing. Not one of them had even fired a shot. It would be dangerous to go any farther from the settlement, but at last they decided to walk 1 more mile up the river. None of them liked the idea, but no one wanted to risk being called a coward for saying so. Soon their luck changed. They came to a shallow, sunlit lake where there were hundreds of wild ducks. The 3 muskets began banging. Small white clouds of smoke drifted through the rushes. Birds came splashing down into the sparkling water. "Let's go home now," said one of Pierre's companions. He waded ashore and dropped a fine plump duck on the ground. "We have enough birds for everybody." He looked at the dark forest around them. It would be stupid to go any farther, he added. Pierre, suddenly realizing how much he had been enjoying himself, the good, fresh air, the sunshine, and the blue sky all seemed better outside that hateful stockade. This was the first time he had walked through the forest. He did not want to leave its green and brown beauty for a long time yet. Go if you wish, he said. I'll walk on alone. You're a fool to risk it, said the boy who wanted to go home. If there are any war parties anywhere near here, they will have heard our shots. The quicker we leave, the better. I too wish to return, said the second young man. Be wise and come with us, Pierre. Pierre shook his head. I am going on, he repeated firmly. It isn't noon yet, and I want to shoot more birds. They stood arguing for several minutes. The others would not go any farther. In fact, they were beginning to wish they had not come quite so far. Pierre was determined to spend the afternoon hunting. At last it was settled. The other two began walking back to Three Rivers. Pierre, feeling proud of himself, marched upriver through the forest. Before long he came across as much game as any hunter could wish to see. He was loading and firing as fast as he could. Finally he had to stop and leave some of the birds he had shot in a hollow tree. He meant to pick them up when he came back that way later on. Meanwhile he walked on up the bank, enjoying every minute of his adventure. The sun showed that it was late afternoon when Pierre got back to the hollow tree. He loaded 2 geese, a wild turkey, and 12 ducks on his shoulders. He was tired already, and his load seemed to grow heavier with every step he took. When he had nearly reached the clearing where he had left his friends, Pierre dropped the birds and sat down beside them to rest. He wished that he had not come quite so far. He would have to walk fast to reach Three Rivers before sunset. In the green twilight of the forest in front of him, a stick snapped loudly as if a foot had trodden on it. The noise startled Pierre. He grabbed his musket and sat staring around him. The forest was dead quiet. Nothing, not even a bird, could be heard moving. Softly he drew out his pistols and made sure they were ready to fire. The powder in one of them seemed to have become wet. He cocked the hammer and pulled the trigger. There was a loud bang that must have been heard a mile away if anyone was listening. Pierre quickly reloaded, glancing up every now and then to make sure no Indians were creeping towards him. When the pistol was ready, he picked up his load, slung the musket on his shoulder, and started along the trail back to the settlement. His knees were trembling slightly, and not only because he was tired. Pierre was just a little scared. Half a mile farther on, the path curved round to the left. He tramped along it, wondering if he would get a welcome or a scolding from his parents. Suddenly he gasped with fright and stopped dead. In the long grass beside the path, 2 naked bodies lay sprawled, their white skins smeared with blood. In spite of his horror, Pierre stepped a little closer and recognized his companions. They were dead. One had been tomahawked, the other shot and stabbed. Both of them had been scalped. His fright and shock started Pierre's nose bleeding. He stood staring a minute, then began to tiptoe towards the riverbank with a handkerchief clutched to his nose. Before he reached the water, his eyes met another terrifying sight, a row of heads above the bushes. The faces were painted, tufted black locks of hair stood up on brown shaven skulls. They were Iroquois. They had seen him. Instead of dropping everything he was carrying and running for his life, Pierre, moved by a desperate courage, stopped and loaded his musket with a heavy lead ball. Carrying the weapon in one hand, he went on down the path that led to the river, shaking with fright. Could it be possible that the Iroquois had not noticed him? If they had, why were they taking so long to attack him? In the forest close beside him, a couple of muskets went off with loud bangs. 2 bullets screamed over his head, their noise drowned by piercing Iroquois war cries. Indians came running and jumping at Pierre from among the trees. Pierre dropped his birds. He raised the heavy musket to his shoulder, glanced along its barrel, sighted a charging figure, and squeezed the trigger. There was a roar and a red flash. The figure disappeared. Dropping the empty gun, Pierre grabbed his pistols. The screaming, running Indians were nearly on him now. He could see the gleam of their knives and axes. He sighted quickly and fired. The pistol banged and jumped in his hand. An Indian clutched his face and tumbled forward with a shriek. Pierre sighted carefully for his last shot and again pressed the trigger. Another Indian threw up his arms and went down. Pierre did not see him fall. Muscular arms had wrapped themselves round him and hurled him to the ground. Hard, bony bodies fell on top of him, bruising him and nearly knocking him unconscious. Pierre hoped desperately that the Iroquois would be angry enough to kill him then and there. He hoped to die like his friends. If his life was spared now, he knew what would happen to him later on. He would be dragged back to an Indian village and tortured to death in front of a laughing, yelling crowd of men, women, and children. Death from a tomahawk blow would be quicker and easier than dying at a stake in the midst of jeers. But Pierre did not die in that forest. Perhaps the Indians admired the white boy's courage in fighting back at them as they charged. Perhaps they were in a good temper because they had already killed 2 Frenchmen that day. They hauled Pierre to his feet, terrified him still further by waving his friends' scalps in front of his eyes, and then dragged him with them into the forest. They made him walk 5 miles. Every time he stumbled, an Indian struck him across the shoulders with the handle of a tomahawk. Somehow he was able to keep going until the Iroquois reached their camp. By that time he was half dead from weariness and fear. The camp lay in a small patch of open ground near the river. Canoes were drawn up on the shore. Other Iroquois warriors were sitting or sprawling round a fire. The Indians began preparing a meal for themselves. Some of them tore off Pierre's clothes, laughing as they patted his white skin. They tied a rope round his waist when they sat down to eat and made signs to Pierre to squat beside them on the ground. Then they tried to feed him. Pierre was much too frightened to want to eat. In any case, even if he had been dying of hunger, he would have shrunk from eating that horrible meal. Dried corn had been thrown into a cooking pot. After it went meat that was rotten and full of maggots. While the filthy mess was still uncooked, the Indians began helping themselves with their hands. In spite of Pierre's distaste, they forced him to swallow mouthful after mouthful, making angry signs at him when he shook his head. Stars were shining when the party lay down to sleep on the ground. A warrior gave Pierre a thin cotton blanket and signed to him to wrap himself up in it. When he stretched himself on the earth, 2 warriors, one on each side, lay down with him. Each of them had one end of the rope round Pierre's waist. They were making sure he did not try to escape. Tired out, terrified, and feeling sick from the dreadful food he had been obliged to eat, Pierre wondered miserably whether he would lie awake all night. Much to his surprise, he did not. He went to sleep almost as quickly as the Indians. When he woke up, the trees were visible against a gray morning sky. For breakfast, the Iroquois picked up last night's cooking pots and once more heated the food in them over the fire. Again they made Pierre eat with them. This morning, however, they no longer shouted and pretended to strike him. They went out of their way to find the least rotten parts of the meat and invited him to swallow them. Pierre did his best. He closed his eyes and gulped down the pieces, hoping that would please his captors. As soon as the sun came up, the Iroquois packed their belongings into the canoes and made Pierre lie face down in the bottom of one. The party pushed off from the shore, singing, shouting, and laughing as they paddled upstream with long, easy strokes that sent the canoes shooting along with marvelous speed. Pierre lay in his canoe for most of the day. He felt sick, he was as frightened as ever, and he spent most of his time wondering what the Iroquois were going to do with him. He still hoped that they might grow tired of having him with them and knock him on the head with an axe, but somehow his wish for death was not quite so strong this morning. The splash of paddles and the singing stopped when the sun was going down in the west. Pierre carefully raised his stiff and aching body so that he could stare over the side of the canoe. Ahead of him he saw a mass of dark green islands covered with trees. Around them flowed the great St. Lawrence, its surface golden in the last light of the sun. Pierre did not know it, but these were the Isles of Ricliot. The Iroquois war party from the south had chosen the islands for their central camp. Over 200 warriors were already there. Teepees were scattered on every island. Cooking fires flamed and smoked beside them. The fires were grilling good fresh meat, for there was plenty of game along that stretch of river. Pierre discovered that when he was given a fine lump of freshly killed venison. He felt better when he lay down to sleep that night, even though the rope round his waist reminded him that he was still a prisoner. The band of Indians who had captured Pierre spent 3 days idling round their fires. Every now and then 1 or 2 of them went off to hunt in the woods. No hunter ever came back without bringing a deer with him. Sometimes the Indians speared fish in the shallow water off the shore. They fed Pierre with everything they cooked, and as the days passed they began to treat him with much more kindness. Soon they gave him back his clothes. One day some of the Iroquois decided to dress Pierre's hair in better style. He wore it long and his locks had become badly tangled and dirty since he had been taken prisoner. They combed it out with a rough comb carved out of wood. Then they dragged it backwards and tied it in a knot on top of his head. They ornamented the knot by winding a piece of red ribbon in and out of it. The warriors laughed when they admired the result. "Chigon," they said to the solemn Pierre. "Chigon." Pierre had no idea what the word meant. He spent a good deal of time wondering about it. Certainly he would have felt much better if he had known that it meant cheer up. The Iroquois were telling him not to be afraid. When the party had been on the island a week, Pierre's guardian took the rope off his waist. He made signs that Pierre could now go wherever he pleased. It was impossible to go very far on a small island, but Pierre felt much more cheerful from then on. He was sorry when the time came to get back into the canoes. This time he did not have to lie on his face. The Indian to whom Pierre seemed to belong gave him a paddle. Pierre sweated away with it, trying to show the Iroquois that he was doing his best and hoping to please everyone. He was not very skillful. The amount of water he threw all around and the number of times he nearly upset the canoe made everyone else shriek with laughter. At last the Indian with Pierre stopped laughing and began giving him lessons in paddling. He showed Pierre how to make the smooth, easy movements that would not tire him out even after a whole day's paddling. When the canoes were carried ashore that night, Pierre felt happier than he had since the Indians captured him, though he still had no idea what was going to happen to him in the end. Sometimes he dared to hope the kind treatment he was receiving meant that no one was going to hurt him. At other times he remembered the stories he had heard about the Iroquois. The torture stake haunted his dreams nearly every night. The war party left the St. Lawrence and began traveling south up the Richelieu River. They were returning to their villages. Every day the fleet of canoes grew smaller. Warriors reached their homes, shouted farewell to their companions, and paddled ashore. The men with Pierre kept on. Their canoes entered Lake Champlain, skimming southward along it, down another stream, and into the Mohawk River on whose shores stood their villages. Soon they would be home. One night after they had eaten supper, the braves sharpened a knife and shaved Pierre's head, leaving only a long, thick tuft of hair on top of it. This lock they stiffened with river clay and some of their own red paint. The work took several hours, but Pierre patiently waited until the Indians had finished. He thought that the more fun they had with him, the less willing they would be to torture him. At last the Indians sat back on their heels and studied the results of their fun. One of them handed Pierre a small mirror in which he could admire his new appearance. But Pierre was not much amused. He had no wish to look like an Iroquois brave. The Indians seemed to be growing fond of Pierre as the days went past. He was a cheerful lad, and his good spirit began to return, in spite of his worry about what was going to happen to him. Sometimes he sang little French songs to the war party as they sat round the campfire. Pierre had a good voice and a fine sense of humor. Both gifts helped him to get along with Indians wherever he went. The Iroquois began teaching him words of their own language. Pierre was quick to learn them. At the end of a fortnight, he could understand a good deal of what was said to him and could make himself understood. The Indian in Pierre's canoe told him that from now on they were brothers. The news made Pierre still more cheerful. Surely even Iroquois would not torture their own brothers. One morning, Pierre's brother found him standing on the beach, flourishing a sword. Like most boys of his age in those days, Pierre could handle a sword as well as firearms. The Indian grinned approvingly. Later, he took the sword and showed Pierre one or two Iroquois tricks with it. There was another reason why Pierre was so popular with his captors. He could shoot much better than any of them. The braves had quite a few muskets in their canoes, but they did not understand how to aim them. Often, the war party came across deer grazing along the banks. It was always Pierre who picked up a musket and shot the animal. The surrounding forests were full of bears. When the Iroquois went hunting them, they took Pierre and his gun. Bears were the favorite food with the Indians, and they shouted with approval every time the boy shot one. Pierre himself must have been just as glad. He had no wish to return to a diet of that awful meat he had been given on his first night as a prisoner. The Iroquois were getting near their own settlements. They no longer camped in the forest at night, but stayed in one of the many villages dotted along the banks of the river. Pierre hated these villages. The Indians in them looked upon him merely as another white prisoner. Some teased him with wicked cleverness. A few struck him. All of them made it quite clear that white men were only good for the fiery stake. Pierre did nothing to protect himself against these tormentors. He tried desperately to hide the fact that he was terribly frightened. Whenever an Indian hit him, he smiled and tried to make friends with the man. Something different happened one evening. He was given a chance to have a little revenge. The war party had stopped for the night. A group of Indian boys of about Pierre's own age gathered to stare at him. They made loud remarks about his white skin and his stupidity in being taken prisoner. They shouted that he must be a coward. At last one of them stepped forward and smacked Pierre across the face. Pierre could do nothing. He smiled at the boy and kept his hands down. To hit back might have meant all kinds of punishment. But his Indian brother had seen the blow and came running. He put his hand on Pierre's shoulder and thrust him at the grinning youth. "Do not be afraid," said the Iroquois. "We will not harm you. Go, fight back at him who struck you." Those were the best words Pierre could have heard. He was tired of being beaten and of being unable to do anything about it. Now he was actually being told to defend himself against the Indian youth who stood in front of him smirking. Pierre leaped at the startled Indian, grabbed his topknot, and punched him hard on the nose. The Indian yelled and grabbed Pierre's own topknot. Pierre replied by clawing the Indian's face. Then he unloosed another punch and followed it up by biting the Indian's arm as hard as he could. This was going to be a good fight. The Iroquois came running from all over the village to enjoy it. They formed a circle round the two boys, yelling and shouting advice to both of them. The young Iroquois had been brought up in the belief that white boys could not fight. Now he was discovering the error of that belief. He was going to have to fight as hard as he could if he was to avoid being thrashed in front of his own tribe. Pierre was equally determined to defeat him. He knew that winning this fight would make his own party of Indians even more friendly towards him. He had to have as many friends as he could. The fight was dirty from start to finish. The Indian tried to jab his fingers in Pierre's eyes. Pierre bit the fingers until their owner roared with pain. The Indian again grabbed Pierre's topknot and tried to dash him to the ground. Pierre slashed the Indian's face with his fingernails. They went into a clinch, each straining to throw the other backward. The Indian soon felt that Pierre's arms were stronger than his own. He wriggled out of the clinch, stepped back a pace, and tried to kick Pierre in the stomach. That was a bad mistake. The Indian had bare feet. Pierre was wearing good heavy shoes with thick nail-studded soles. The kick he landed on the Iroquois made him bellow with pain. Once again the Iroquois tried to grab Pierre's topknot. Pierre seized the reaching hand, turned his back on his enemy, dragged the youth's arm over his shoulder, and levered the arm downward. It was a famous old wrestling trick that Pierre had learned from the French fishermen in St. Malo, and it worked like a miracle. The Iroquois shot up in the air. He flew over Pierre's crouching shoulders, came down with a heavy thud, and lay sprawling on his back, gasping for breath and dizzy from the violence of his fall. Pierre jumped on his chest, squatted there, and started pounding the Indian's face with his fists. At this point, the cheering Iroquois came forward and dragged Pierre away from his bruised and bloody victim. That was the end of the fight. Winning the battle was the best thing Pierre could have done. His brother clapped him on the back, washed the blood off his face, and gave him a fine supper that night. The other Iroquois braves grinned and joked with Pierre as he ate. Only one thing they said made Pierre start worrying all over again. "Tomorrow," the Iroquois said smilingly, "we will reach our own village."